and African Free Trade Area integration.
For over 30 years, Japan and Africa have built solid trust through TCAD.
The ambitious agreement also hopes to harmonize the policies of African countries.
While the West debates aid and debt relief,
it didn't begin with ships. It didn't begin with airports. It began with a rumor and a nation terrified of shadows that never came. The project began with noble intentions. Japan's launch of a cultural exchange with African nations, a bridge between continents built on mutual respect and understanding. The promise was beautiful in its simplicity. Hopes of friendship, education, and shared opportunity. Two worlds coming together, learning from each other's wisdom. But then came the panic. False rumors of mass African migration spark protests. Fear spread faster than facts, and reason became the first casualty. Japan, a nation often perceived through a lens of serene temples and disciplined order, found itself grappling with a very different reality. The quiet hum of its cities was being replaced by the roar of discontent. This wasn't a conflict fought with traditional weapons, but one waged in the invisible currents of the digital world, where truth and fiction blurred into a potent, combustible mixture. The first shots were fired not on the streets, but from anonymous accounts in the dark corners of the internet, meticulously crafting a narrative of fear that would soon spill out into the open. The campaign was insidious in its design. It began with a trickle of fabricated news articles, complete with doctored statistics and falsified expert quotes. They targeted a small but growing community of African immigrants, falsely linking them to a non-existent surge in violent crime and a drain on social services. AI-generated images depicted staged altercations, while deep-faked audio clips of public officials seemingly confessing to a cover-up were circulated in private messaging groups. Each piece of content was engineered for maximum emotional impact, designed to bypass rational thought and tap directly into latent anxieties about cultural change and economic uncertainty. This digital poison spread with terrifying speed. Social media algorithms, optimized for engagement above all else, rewarded the most inflammatory content, pushing it into the feeds of millions. Online echo chambers amplified the lies, creating a feedback loop where skepticism was shouted down and fear was validated. What started as a fringe conspiracy theory, confined to obscure forums, rapidly metastasized into a mainstream panic. It was a masterclass in modern propaganda, demonstrating how easily a society's trust could be eroded from within, pixel by pixel. And so, the year T. The digital conflict had found its physical stage. In Tokyo, the iconic Shibuya crossing, normally a symbol of harmonious chaos, was choked with protesters. Their signs, written in stark, bold characters, screamed slogans born from online falsehoods. Police formed barriers, their stoic presence a stark contrast to the raw emotion swirling around them. The air, usually filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation, was thick with angry chants and the blare of megaphones. The scenes were mirrored across the country. We saw, in Osaka, the vibrant, food-loving heart of the Kansai region, the mood was just as grim. Along the Dotonbori Canal, beneath the glittering neon signs, crowds gathered, their faces a mixture of anger, confusion, and genuine fear. These weren't just radicals. They were grandparents, office workers, and students, people from all walks of life who had been swept up in the tide of disinformation. They had been led to believe their way of life was in imminent danger. The protest signs told the story in stark detail. They weren't just generic anti-immigration slogans. They were specific, quoting the fake statistics and referencing the fabricated incidents that had been seeded online. "Protect our children from foreign crime," one read, held by a woman who looked more like a concerned mother than a political activist. Another displayed a graph, its data entirely fictional, proving a link between immigration and unemployment. It was the physical manifestation of a digital lie. This siege mentality was pervasive. It turned neighbors into suspects and transformed cultural curiosity into fear. The targeted African community, many of whom had lived in Japan for years, contributing to its economy and society, suddenly found themselves viewed with suspicion and hostility. Yet, amidst the noise, a counter-narrative was struggling to be heard. Small groups of academics, journalists, and citizen activists worked tirelessly to debunk the lies, publishing fact checks and organizing community dialogues. They were a quiet voice of reason against a storm of hysteria, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the fight for truth is never truly lost. But the reality, once you stepped away from the glowing screens and into the crisp air of a Japanese morning, was starkly, almost surreally, different. The digital inferno of panic and outrage found no fuel in the tangible world. There was no surge. There was no invasion. There was only a profound and unsettling silence where the crisis was supposed to be. To understand the scale of this disconnect, one only needs to look at the data, the cold, hard numbers meticulously compiled by Japan's own Immigration Services Agency. For years, these figures have told a consistent story, one that stands in direct opposition to the narrative of a floodgate being thrown open. As of the latest official count, the total number of foreign residents in Japan hovers around 3 million people. Within that population, individuals from the entire continent of Africa, all 54 countries, make up a fraction of a single percent. We're talking about a community numbering in the low thousands, scattered across a nation of 125 million. To put that into perspective, it's a number dwarfed by residents from neighboring Asian countries and even by expatriates from Europe and the Americas. The very structure of Japan's immigration system makes a sudden, uncontrolled surge a logistical impossibility. The path to residency is notoriously stringent, governed by a complex web of visa categories, each with its own demanding requirements for skills, education, or financial backing. The asylum process is one of the most restrictive in the developed world, with an acceptance rate that has historically lingered below 1%. The threat being described online wasn't just an exaggeration. It was a fantasy, a scenario completely untethered from the legal and bureaucratic realities of the country. So, if the crisis wasn't real, where did it come from? It was a phantom, born in the dark corners of the internet and nurtured by algorithms designed for engagement at any cost. It began with a handful of anonymous accounts, posting out-of-context videos and doctored images. A clip of a brawl in a European city, relabeled as Shinjuku. A photo of refugees arriving in Greece, presented as Narita Airport. These digital seeds of discord were then watered by a torrent of xenophobic commentary, amplified by social media platforms that reward outrage. Each share, each angry comment, taught the algorithm that this was valuable content, pushing it into the feeds of more and more people. It was a textbook case of a moral panic, a manufactured threat created to unify a group against a perceived other. The enemy wasn't at the gates. The enemy was a ghost in the machine. And this ghost had real-world consequences. For the small, established black community in Japan, life began to change. The digital hatred didn't stay online. It seeped into daily interactions, poisoning the air. There were the prolonged stares on the subway, the sudden clutching of purses, the empty seats next to them on a crowded train. Black business owners reported suspicious calls. Parents spoke of their children being asked strange and hurtful questions at school. The constant, low-level hum of suspicion was exhausting. It was the psychological burden of being turned into a symbol, a walking representation of a threat that doesn't exist. You're no longer an individual, a teacher, an engineer, a friend, a neighbor, but a caricature, a focal point for a stranger's baseless fear. The crisis, then, was not one of immigration, but of information. It was a crisis of perception, fueled by a global rise in anti-blackness and xenophobia that found fertile ground in a nation grappling with its own anxieties about cultural identity and a rapidly aging population. The irony is that Japan is facing a very real demographic crisis, a shrinking workforce and a declining birth rate. Experts have long pointed to managed immigration as a vital component of any sustainable solution. The very people being vilified online are part of a demographic that Japan desperately needs to welcome, not reject. The invasion was a lie. The fear, however, was real. And the tragedy is that this fear was directed not at the complex economic and social challenges Japan truly faces, but at a handful of human beings who had simply chosen to build a life here. The crisis existed only in the minds of those who chose to believe the lies, but its shadow fell on everyone. This revealed deep anxiety within Japanese society, Japan's long struggle with immigration and identity, a nation caught between its insular past and its globalized future. This became a globalization clash. How a cultural exchange became a symbol of insecurity, progress and fear locked in an eternal battle for the soul of a nation. African reactions were measured but pointed. Disappointment at Japan's fragile commitment. A continent forced to question whether Japan was truly ready for genuine partnership. Media spin amplified every whisper into a roar. How headlines and social media amplified misinformation. Truth became the casualty in a war fought with lies and fear. This reveals the bigger picture. Fragile cross-cultural partnerships in a globalized world. How quickly trust can shatter when fear overwhelms reason. What it means for Africa is clear. But to truly grasp the weight of that clarity, we must first look beyond the quiet ports of Japan and see the global chessboard on which this peculiar drama played out. This wasn't an isolated incident of national anxiety. It was a symptom, a single data point in the sprawling narrative of the 21st century. A century defined by Africa's re-emergence and the world's often clumsy, sometimes fearful reaction to it. The echoes of this non-event, this phantom crisis, reverberate far beyond the Sea of Japan, carrying profound lessons for a continent on the move. The first, and perhaps most crucial of these lessons, is about dependency. For generations, the relationship between Africa and much of the developed world has been framed through the lens of aid, of assistance, of a fundamental imbalance, a narrative of the helping hand and the grateful recipient. This story, while sometimes born of genuine altruism, has also been a cage, subtly reinforcing a global hierarchy and stifling the recognition of Africa's own immense potential and agency. The Japanese episode, in its strange way, holds up a mirror to this dynamic. The fear was not of equals arriving, but of dependence overwhelming a system. It was predicated on an old, tired image of Africa as a source of problems, not a source of solutions, talent, or partnership. This phantom fleet of migrants, imagined to be crossing oceans in desperation, was a projection of that dependency narrative, and its failure to materialize serves as a powerful metaphor. It suggests that the world's assumptions about Africa are lagging dangerously behind Africa's reality. The continent is no longer defined solely by its needs, but by its ambitions, its innovations, and its growing economic muscle. The lesson here is a call to accelerate the psychological shift away from a mindset of dependency. It is a reminder that relying on the perceived goodwill or openness of others without a foundation of mutual respect and equal standing is to build a future on shifting sands. True progress lies not in seeking aid, but in forging partnerships. Not in being a subject of international policy, but in being an architect of it. The silence in that Japanese airport was a quiet indictment of an old world order, and a powerful invitation for Africa to fully embrace its own strength on its own terms. And this leads us to the second, deeply personal lesson: the unwavering importance of dignity. In the storm of media speculation and political fear-mongering that preceded the non-arrival, the African was rendered invisible. In their place stood a caricature, a statistic, a faceless threat. Millions were coming, they said. A tide, a flood, a siege. The language itself was dehumanizing, stripping away individuality, history, and humanity, reducing people to a natural disaster. This is a tactic as old as prejudice itself. To control a population, you must first control the story told about them. You must erase their dignity. Dignity is not a gift to be bestowed by a host nation. It is an inherent right, carried in the heart of every individual who dares to dream of a different future, whether they cross a street or an ocean. The imagined crisis in Japan was a profound act of indignity, an assault not on Japan's borders, but on the very character of a billion people. It presumed the worst, and in doing so, revealed its own deep-seated biases. For Africa, the lesson is a fierce and urgent call to reclaim and project its own narrative of dignity. It means investing in our own media, celebrating our own storytellers, and challenging every caricature, every stereotype, in every corner of the globe. It means ensuring that when the world looks at Africa, it sees not a problem to be managed but a rich tapestry of cultures, a powerhouse of human potential, and a continent of individuals, each with a name, a face, and a story worthy of being heard. The fight for Africa's future is, in many ways, a fight for its image. It is the battle to replace the world's fearful imaginings with the continent's vibrant, dignified reality. This brings us to the third and most strategic lesson: the critical art of choosing partners. The era of accepting any outstretched hand, regardless of the strings attached or the assumptions behind the smile, is decisively over. Africa is now in a position of choice. The continent is the youngest and fastest growing in the world, a hub of rare earth minerals, and a burgeoning market of immense proportions. The world needs Africa as much as, if not more than, Africa needs the world. This is the new reality. And with this reality comes the responsibility of discernment. What does a true partner look like? The Japanese case study, though an example of failure, provides a valuable checklist of what to avoid. A true partner does not view you through a lens of fear and suspicion. A true partner does not see your people as a potential burden, but as a potential asset, as entrepreneurs, innovators, students, and collaborators. A true partner engages not with a caricature, but with the complex, dynamic reality of the continent. They invest not just for extraction, but for mutual growth. They share technology not to create dependency, but to foster self-sufficiency. They respect cultural sovereignty and work within frameworks of shared values. The lesson for every African nation, from the smallest island state to the largest economic power, is to approach international relations with a clear-eyed strategic vision. It is to ask the hard questions. What are the underlying assumptions of this proposed partnership? Does it respect our agency? Does it align with our long-term goals for sustainable development and social progress? Does it empower our people? The world is full of potential partners, each with their own agenda. The challenge and the opportunity for Africa is to navigate this complex landscape with confidence, to leverage its growing influence, and to forge alliances that are not just profitable in the short term, but are also built on the bedrock of mutual dignity and genuine respect. To understand how to move forward, we must first deconstruct the lie that brought us here. They said millions were coming. They said Japan was under siege. Who were they? Our investigation reveals it wasn't a single voice, but a chorus of fear, amplified through a modern echo chamber. It began not in the halls of government with credible intelligence, but in the murky corners of the internet, on ultranationalist blogs and anonymous forums. These whispers were then picked up by sensationalist weekly magazines, their covers screaming in bold katakana alongside lurid photos. From there, it bled into mainstream television, where commentators and so-called experts, with no real data, drew ominous arrows on maps, pointing from the heart of Africa to the shores of Japan, as if illustrating an invasion. This narrative found fertile ground in a nation grappling with its own deep-seated anxieties, a rapidly aging population, a shrinking workforce, and a long history of cultural and political isolation. The phantom African migrant became a convenient scapegoat, a vessel for fears that had little to do with Africa itself, and everything to do with Japan's struggle to define its place in a globalized world. The crisis was a projection, a national fever dream. It was the fear of change, the fear of the unknown, the fear of a future that would not look like the past, all condensed and personified into the figure of the African stranger. It was a masterclass in manufacturing consent for a policy of exclusion, built not on facts, but on feelings. And so, the stage was set. The media had built the tension to a fever pitch. The public was braced for impact. Immigration centers were reportedly put on alert. A nation held its breath, waiting for the floodgates to open. And then, nothing. The truth was silence. A profound, deafening, and deeply revealing silence. The arrival terminals remained cavernous and empty. The luggage carousels stood motionless. The immigration booths, staffed for a deluge, processed only the usual trickles of tourists and business travelers. The millions never came. The siege was a ghost. This silence was more powerful than any protest or political statement. It was the sound of a lie collapsing under its own weight. It was the stark, undeniable evidence of a fear that was entirely imagined. The crisis was not at the border. It was in the minds of those who had propagated the fear. It revealed that a phantom, conjured from prejudice and anxiety, can be a more potent political tool than any real threat. It can shape policy, sway public opinion, and poison international relations without a single person ever crossing a border. The fear was a ghost, conjured from the anxieties of a nation confronting the limits of its own openness. And the silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the deafening silence of a prophecy that failed, a prejudice laid bare for all to see. In the end, the story was never about Africans arriving in Japan. It was about Japan confronting itself. It was about a nation, and, by extension, the wider world, being forced to look at the gap between their perception of Africa and its reality. The crisis was a mirror, and what it reflected was not an external threat, but an internal fear. For Africa, the path forward is illuminated by the lessons from this reflection. The journey is one of self-reliance, of championing our own dignity, and of choosing our partners with wisdom and strength. The greatest myths are not the stories told about us, but the stories we allow to be told without challenge. This is Insight Africa, where we uncover the myths they want you to believe and empower the truths we must build for ourselves.